Well, the question over the weekend seemed to be, what's China going to do to respond to this tariff threat? Now we see this devaluation in the yuan. So let's use iPhones as a bit of a lens to understand this. What are the implications you see for iPhone sales in China in the back half of the year on this weaker currency, and then exports from China given these tariffs?
Sure. So look, I think the export issue is more likely here and now, which is if a 10% tariff does indeed occur on September 1, Apple has two choices. One, do you pass along the tariff in the form of a price hike, or do you eat it, or ultimately some combination of both? If you don't pass along the price increase and Apple effectively eats it, it's up to an 80-cent earnings hit next year. That's about a 7% cut to earnings. And perhaps equally importantly, company gross margins go down about 150 basis points. And that's a figure that investors care a lot about. If you do pass along the price increases, then you're gauging, well, are consumers going to buy less phones? And the answer is yes. And the question is, how much less? And sort of the break even on that math is if they buy roughly 20% less phones in the U.S., that's probably the equivalent of Apple eating the price increase itself. And so that's a tactical decision that Apple needs to make. Now, in the first part of your question, what happens in China, that's the big unknown. Mainland China is about 13% of Apple's revenues. And so Apple's a high-profile company. They could certainly be targeted uniquely or more broadly in terms of tariffed U.S. goods in China. And so there's risk on both sides, the potential tariff in the U.S., and then, as you were all talking about before, potential retribution from China.
Tony, when you look at the Dow, of the four worst performing stocks today, three are tech names and names you cover: Apple, IBM, also Intel. Well, maybe you don't cover Intel, but in terms of the sell-off in these names, does it make sense to you? And how much worse do you think it could get, given the fact that there are so many unknowns and uncertainties out there?
Sure. Well, in IBM's case, part of the sell-off attributable to them is they had a webcast on Friday, and there was sort of mixed news out of that. They provided some updated guidance for the current quarter that was below consensus, and so I think you have investors reacting to that. Generally, IBM has much less exposure to China. In fact, very limited exposure. Only about 5% of its revenues are sold into China. Moreover, it doesn't really import anything from China. So typically in tech, IBM is a relative safe haven. I think on Intel, the worry is that if you do have incremental tariffs, that's going to affect PC demand, most notably notebook PCs, all of which are made in mainland China. And so ultimately, you're going to have the same kind of potential trade-off here, which is prices are going to have to be passed along or absorbed by manufacturers. If prices are passed along, you're invariably going to have less demand, and that will impact Intel.
Do want to note major indices trying to stage a bit of a comeback. The Dow is down as much as 600-plus points, now right around 500. The S&P also trying to come back a bit, but still down nearly 2%. Tony, I want to go back to Apple and iPhones for a moment. This last quarter, Tim Cook on the call, the things he said seemed to suggest to me that price sensitivity really was an issue for Apple, especially around the iPhone, and that the trade-in and the VAT flexibility that Apple experienced in China really helped them have such a good quarter. Given that, do you think Apple's more likely to absorb any potential impact on either side that would raise the price of iPhones just to keep the momentum going?
Well, I think Apple will try and keep price increases to a minimum, but I think a 10% tariff is too hard to absorb uniquely. I think one thing that Apple has from a timing perspective that is fortunate is that it will be releasing new iPhones as it typically does at the end of September. And so when you introduce new iPhones, you have some flexibility in base price of the unit, but you also have flexibility in terms of how much storage you put in and what kind of pricing you attribute to that storage. So fortunately, NAND prices have been going down very steeply over the last 6 to 12 months. But for instance, if you look at the high-end iPhones today, you can get them with 64 gig of NAND storage. That's the base model. If you get 256, it's an extra $150. If you get 512, it's an extra $350. So Apple has an ability to potentially play with those configurations. Perhaps ordinarily those configurations would have gone up and price wouldn't have changed. Perhaps that won't be the case on the new iPhones. You'll still have the same amount of NAND at the same price or potentially marginally higher prices, which is one way that Apple may be able to sort of crawl back some of the potential impact from tariffs.